Well, good evening. I think I turned myself on. Yep. All right. So, yeah, the Eastland, deadliest shipwreck in Great Lakes history. And she did, in fact, help win two world wars. One thing I forgot to mention in my little intro there that I gave you, she also has played an integral part in the creation of Monday Night Football. So, the Eastland is quite the story. And as I go through this, I get a lot of comments and a lot of compliments that people enjoy my little sidebar stories and my presentations. If you've been to my other ones and you've appreciated that, hang on, you ain't seen nothing yet. This one is full of really interesting sidebar stories. I do have to admit, though, I'm just slightly more nervous than usual tonight because the guy who taught me how to tell a history story is watching me. And so I'm hoping I do a good job. But the Eastland disaster. So I always like to set the scene, right, with how the ship came to life. And we have to go all the way back to 1903. And the Eastland was built in Port Huron, Michigan at the Jenks Shipbuilding Yard. And she is supposed to be a passenger and packet freight steamer. And she's built to run on Lake Michigan from South Haven to Chicago. So she's launched on May 5th, and she head for the Michigan Steamship Company, and she heads over to her home base of South Haven. And she had some very particular requirements when she was constructed, because at that time, South Haven had a sandbar at the entrance to its harbor. And so she had to be able to have a very shallow draft to get over the sandbar, because in 1903, dredging abilities aren't what they are today. And so she had to be able to get high enough in the water to go over the sandbar and get on her way. And of course, in her maiden trip, what does she do? She gets stuck on the sandbar. That is absolutely how sailing goes. But she by all accounts, was a very good looking boat. The owners were impressed with her when she was delivered. And she's born into a really interesting and exciting time period in Great Lakes history. In that early 20th century, especially on Lake Michigan, you had these boats that would carry passengers and also packet freight. And the reason there were so many is, one, it was still a common way to travel in the early 1900s when not everyone had a car yet. If you had to get around the Great Lakes region, you would definitely want to take a steamer. And a lot of these boats, a lot of their cargo was the fruit from Western Michigan. They were hauling apples and cherries. And because of that, you end up with these boats having different home ports: South Haven, Grand Haven, Muskegon. And you end up with these communities adopted the boats that home ported in their communities. And so these towns would start to look out for these ships, and they would, like I said, they would adopt these boats and they would start racing. And so they would set it up, either they would leave on a certain day, a certain time, going to the same port. There was different ways they would do it, but they would start racing their boats. The Eastland, the city of Chicago really gave her fits. The Eastland wasn't necessarily the fastest boat on the lakes. She wasn't the slowest. So she won some, she lost some, but the city of Chicago always beat her. And it turned into quite the rivalry. And sailors got into it. People would bet on these races like we bet on horse races. And there would be spotters posted along the route to telegraph in who was leading. And the winning ship was known to come into port with a broom tied to the forward mast to indicate a win. And it was really kind of an interesting time. But like I said, the Eastland won some and lost some. But that city of Chicago kept beating her. And now usually this was good-natured fun for the communities and the sailors. Once in a while, maybe things got a little less friendly. As you see here, despicable tactics. So apparently there was a race against the city of Chicago. The Eastland was still trying to beat her rival. And they were supposed to take off from Chicago when the union bosses showed up and called a fireman's strike. And the Eastland owners always alleged that it was the owners of the city of Chicago had paid off the union bosses to call the strike so the Eastland couldn't race them. I didn't find any evidence of that or actual proof, but that was always the claim, that there were some under the table payoffs to make sure the Eastland couldn't compete in that particular race. She had her typical bumps and bruises of a ship in the early 20th century. She actually breaks her propeller at one point. She runs into a tugboat in the Chicago River and has some trouble with her crew as well. She's about to do her official speed test. They always wait to do the speed test of a new boat until several months later so the equipment can get broke in, the engines can get run in, as they say. And it was supposed to be the trip they were supposed to do their speed test. And this was a really important deal because in the contract for building the Eastland, she had to make 20 miles an hour. And for every quarter of a mile over 20 that she could make, the shipbuilding company was going to get an extra $20,000. For every quarter mile under that 20, they had to pay the owners $2,500. So there's a lot riding on this speed test. So what's the Eastland do? Wraps a wire cable around one of her propellers and burns up all the bearings in her drive shaft. So they had to postpone the speed test. Then we get to August 13th, 1903. I said that she had some trouble with her crew. The Eastland is hit with a mutiny. Not words that you normally see in Great Lakes shipping stories. We always think HMS Bounty and Captain Bligh when you hear the words mutiny. But in the middle of Lake Michigan, the coal passers or the firemen, the guys that are shoveling the coal into the boilers, they mutinied. And so the Eastland kind of goes dead in the water. She's just floating out there in Lake Michigan. And the captain apparently has to grab his revolver and come marching downstairs and locked a couple guys in their cabin and forced the other guys back to work. Now, this is a really serious charge. The one thing you cannot have aboard vessel is a mutiny. That puts everybody at risk. And so as I was doing my research, I'm thinking, okay, this is going to be a pretty clear-cut case. You can't hide a mutiny. You're stuck on a boat. There's a lot of witnesses here. But then about 2 days later in the newspapers, I start seeing that the owners want to drop the charges. They don't want to press any charges against these guys, specifically Glenn Watson and Edward Fleming. And I had to ask myself, why? You have a boat full of passengers and fellow crew members all witness this event. So you've got to have at least 100 witnesses to this mutiny. And again, that's one of the most dangerous things to happen aboard ship. So why would the owners not want to press charges? Why would they not want to make an example of these guys? And I really thought the story would end there. If they're wanting to drop the charges, then clearly there's more to the story than the papers are reporting, and it would just disappear. Well, I was wrong. The grand jury, in fact, did indict Watson and Fleming and said, no, you will stand trial for your actions. As I kept going, I find another article that said the trial, or in this case, the examination, is postponed. No real reason given. And try as I might, and I went forward in the newspapers a couple of years trying to find what happened to these two guys. The other four in this event were immediately exonerated. They went back to work, and it was just these two guys that they focused on. So you have the owners trying to drop the charges. You have a grand jury indicting them. And then their trial seemed to have been postponed indefinitely. Something is not adding up. Well, I put 2 and 2 together, and this history teacher came up with 5. And I have a theory. My theory says this: nobody wanted to sit on the witness stand and testify about what really happened aboard the Eastland. Because what came to light, why did these 6 firemen refuse to work anymore? They went up to the galley for lunch, and the cook was out of mashed potatoes. And so they decided to quit working, and we had the great mashed potato mutiny of Lake Michigan. And I'm guessing that no one could sit on the witness stand with a straight face and accuse 2 men of mutiny over potatoes. And so I never did figure out what happened to these two guys. I assume that saner heads may have prevailed and the charges ultimately were dropped, but I can't prove that. So she had a pretty eventful life already. By the time we get to July 25th, 1915, you can see her here. This is how she would have looked on that particular day. At this point, she's owned by the St. Joseph and Chicago Steamship Company, and she's primarily being used as an excursion boat at this point, or a passenger ship. Still hauling some cargo, but mostly she is used for passengers. And what happens on that particular day is the Eastland and several other ships are chartered by the Western Electric Company. And they put on an annual picnic in Michigan City, Indiana for all their employees and their families. And so they chartered, I think it was 5 boats in total. And so they start loading their employees on these boats. They're going to take them to the theme park at Michigan City. And the Eastland is going to be the first one loaded because she's kind of famous by this point. There's even a song written about the Eastland in 1915. Everyone wants to be on the Eastland. And so they start loading, and you have guys at the gangplanks, right, with a little hand clicker counting the number of people. When they get to 2,500, they close the doors and they tell everyone else, go to the next ship. And the Eastland is supposed to take off. If you kind of look at this, this is a cross section of the Eastland. And if you can imagine that gray line right there is the dock. So if you're down in the engine room, Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson is down there. What he notices is that instead of sitting level in the water, the Eastland has started to list to her port side or away from the dock. Now, that's not all that concerning, especially when you've just loaded 2,500 people on a boat. Boats list. If you're in the middle of a lake on a windy day, those big oar boats still will list. You can feel it. So it's not a cause for an alarm, but he does know he needs to correct it. Now, at the bottom of these boats, there are empty spaces called ballast tanks, and they can pump water into these things to straighten up a list. So what he does is he starts pumping it in to the starboard side of the ship, or the high side. And what he expects to have happen is the Eastland will come back straight up vertical. What actually happens is the Eastland lists too far the other way, and it's now leaning toward the dock. So he starts pumping water into the port side ballast tanks. And as he's watching that clinometer in the engine room, that device that tells him how many degrees the ship is listing, the Eastland comes back straight, lists back over to port. And now he knows he has to pump water out of these tanks. He's filled them up. The boat is still listing, so he has to pump water out. The Eastland has a vital design flaw. He can pump water in easily enough, but on each side of the vessel, he only has one pump and one pipe that will pump water out. So he can't pump this ballast water out fast enough to correct what's going on. He does, he tries, he starts pumping the water out. Normally you would have several ballast pumps that could get this water out in a hurry. He does not have that available to him. And as he's trying to correct this, and as people are watching from the dock and from the bridges of the Chicago River, the mooring lines of the Eastland begin to snap. Those big, thick hawsers that are tying the ship to the dock, they break like rubber bands. And the Eastland falls completely over onto her port side in the Chicago River, throwing hundreds of people into the water and trapping hundreds more inside. And this is how she looks. She rolls completely on her side. And people are just thrown in. And anyone that was in the area at the moment did everything they could to help people. If people that were in boats, tugboats, fishing boats, didn't matter. If they had a boat on the river, they were coming to help. They were pulling survivors out of the water. Any policemen and firefighters that happened to be in the area, they jumped in to help. This is a later shot here. And so you can see, even at the time, people were able to climb over that starboard rail and get on the side of the ship. But it's curved steel and it's all wet and people were slipping. One tugboat captain had a great idea. he actually nosed his tugboat right up to the hull, and he had his guys shovel the coal ash onto the hull to give people something to find some traction. And they could have walked down to his tugboat, and he made like little shuttle runs, taking people back to the dock off the side of the ship. People started bringing in cutting torches. Word spread pretty quick. This is downtown Chicago, and even 1915, there's a lot of people who watched this happen. And so they get workers down there pretty quick with cutting torches because they can hear people tapping inside the ship. The whole ship is not underwater. So there's people alive in there that can't get out. And so these guys start cutting holes in the side of the ship to get people out. And this guy starts running around the side of the Eastland, grabbing these guys with the cutting torches, pulling them away, saying, "Stop cutting holes in my ship." And it's Captain Pedersen. It's the captain of the Eastland. Instead of taking command of the situation like he should, he's actually impeding the rescue process. He is stopping people from rescuing passengers that are trapped inside the Eastland. Everyone, like I said, is rushing to help. Word went out. Any doctors that were available at the local hospitals grabbed their travel bags and headed for the scene. One nurse happened by, and she rushed in, and she started telling people to call the department stores and get blankets down there. Just have the department store start sending blankets for the survivors. She did even remember to tell them, send the bill to Western Electric Company. She thought of everything. If you need one picture to sum up what this day did to Chicago, this is it. This is a Chicago firefighter that was helping with the rescue. And this is a young child that did not survive. And that look on his face, I almost liken it, and it's probably a delicate thing to say, but in 1915, this was Chicago's 9/11. People watched this happen live. They were on the dock. They were on the bridges. They watched these people die. And just that look on that guy's face, this is a Chicago firefighter, right? He has seen it all. And look at the impact that it has on him. Here's a later shot. You can see that coal ash that spread on the bow there from that tugboat. And this is a couple days afterward. You can see those poles sticking up from the side of the boat. They actually ran temporary electric lines out there. They had electric lights up there because the rescue and the recovery efforts went round the clock. So people could actually see what they were doing. Like I said, people in boats, they had a boat. First, they were pulling out survivors, and then they started recovering the lost. And they were recovering bodies as quickly as they could. The city of Chicago actually had to string a net across the river, a couple miles downriver, because people were floating downriver. So they had to capture them there. And through the holes they cut in the side, they're having to pull people out of the hull. One guy happened by. I think he was riding his bike, and he saw the Eastland roll over and people get thrown into the river. And according to reports, he was a very accomplished swimmer. He could hold his breath for something like 4 minutes. And he started jumping in and grabbing survivors and swimming them back to the shore. And when he couldn't find any more survivors, he started recovering the lost. He went for 36 hours, and people kept telling him, "You've got to stop. You've got to rest." He wouldn't. Eventually, the chief of police of Chicago ordered him arrested. Not for committing a crime, but he said, "Put this guy in a jail cell before he kills himself." He might be the only guy in history to be arrested for not committing a crime, but he refused to stop. And after 36 hours of that, he was going to drown himself just through exhaustion. Hard hat divers worked round the clock. They had them in shifts, 4 or 5 hard hat divers at a time, going down inside the Eastland to find the people that did not survive it. This is the scene in the following days. This is the 2nd Illinois Regiment Armory right across from the dock where the Eastland rolled over. They turned it into a makeshift morgue. This is the line of people waiting to get into the morgue to start identifying people. And they didn't let them in for a while. And I'm sure that line goes well past the frame of this picture. And when they finally open it up, this is the scene that greets them. And people are walking these rows of bodies to to identify their family members or their friends. And the real sad fact here is that for a lot of these people, there was no one coming to identify them. This was a family picnic for the workers of Western Electric. It wasn't just for the workers. They could bring their spouses and their kids. There were instances where entire families were lost on the Eastland. There's no one coming to identify them. So the coroner does it. He finally admits people in. They start trying to identify these people. And some of the news articles where they describe the bodies and they're trying to find someone who can identify them. And it goes on for weeks, even days afterward. They've got 25 divers working on the Eastland, trying to recover everyone. Even days later, they have no idea what the death toll is going to be. Days later, no clue. Usually, when we talk about a shipwreck, we're talking about just the crew. This was a passenger ship. And usually when a ship goes down, it's out in the middle of the lake. And when you read the reports, they're kind of faceless names. Unless you are related to them, they're not, there's not a real connection for the general public. Interestingly, the Chicago Tribune managed to get pictures of most of the victims, and they started publishing them. This is a full page ad of the Chicago Tribune, one page. This started out as 4 pages. By the time the story is done, it's going to round up to 7 pages. And so this is an intensely personal event for the city of Chicago. Even if you don't know someone on the Eastland, for days on end, you get your newspaper, you are looking at the faces of the people that were lost. You can't avoid this story. You can't not get sucked into it. The Western Electric Company did their best to help. They said, hey, if you survived yesterday, please come to work today. And at first glance, you have to ask yourself, what are you thinking? But you have to remember, there was no passenger list for the Eastland. They didn't sell tickets to the Eastland for this. They chartered the boat along with 4 others. They just loaded people on until they hit the capacity and then told everyone else to go to the next boat. Nobody knew who was on the Eastland. They knew how many, but they didn't know who. So in a sense, it makes perfect sense to ask all your employees to come to work the next day, because now whoever's missing, you can start to formulate a possible casualty list. But I can't even imagine, right? The next day, if you survive this, the next day you're being asked to come to work. There's always that one crazy story from every disaster, and the Eastland is no different. Turns out, one guy and one girl were thrown into the Chicago River, and they survived by hanging on to each other and helping each other stay afloat. And they decided, well, since we survived that, we might as well get married. I did not find a record of a divorce, so apparently it worked. The governor of Illinois was actually in San Francisco at the time. And of course, he sent his telegram, with the condolences. And he immediately left the conference he was at and came back to Illinois. He got on the first train he could and hustled back to his home state. The mayor of Chicago turned his own office into a relief station. He said, if there is anyone that is looking for a family member or needs help in any way, shape, or form connected to the Eastland, you send them here. He didn't say send them to the Red Cross. He didn't say send them here, send them to there. You come here. He turned his own government office into command central of the recovery efforts. And if you know anything about society in 1915, we had our flaws. And this is really kind of a really unique moment for us, because the majority of those lost on the Eastland were immigrants. Most of them were immigrants from Eastern Europe. And so to have a government official give that kind of commitment to people that, let's face it, faced a lot of discrimination during different parts of our history. And this mayor said, not today. You send them here. The Chicago Tribune started a fund for the families of the victims. They put $1,000 in the pot and ran an ad in their own newspaper, inviting other individuals and companies to donate what they could. Remember, this is 1915. In 24 hours, that fund hit $300,000 in 1915 dollars. It's going to go up from there. That's only in the first 24 hours. They raised $300,000 for the families of the victims. The rest of Chicago wanted to help too. No, I have not switched topics, and no, I have not lost my mind. And yes, that is a baseball field. So some of what the community came up with to raise money for that fund is really unique. There were 11 amateur baseball players lost on the Eastland when it rolled over. Now, this is long before the days of the minor league system. So you had amateur baseball leagues, and occasionally a major league team would have a tryout. And if you were an amateur player, you could go try out and try to make the major league team. Well, the Chicago White Sox were supposed to play at home the day the Eastland rolled over. And in light of the tragedy, they, of course, canceled the game, and their next scheduled game was on the road. They were going to New York to play the Yankees. And there was supposed to be one of those tryouts in the near future for the White Sox. And so Charles Comiskey, the owner of the White Sox, says, you know what, instead of a tryout, why don't we bring the amateur guys in and they'll play a doubleheader. And we're going to let them play on the big league field. And we're going to donate 100% of the ticket sales to the Eastland Relief Fund. Comiskey Park was sold out. The head groundskeeper even promised to have the field in condition as if the White Sox were playing for the pennant that day. They groomed up the field. These amateurs got to play on a caliber field they had never played on before. But the owner of a Major League Baseball team donated the use of his stadium for the Eastland Relief Fund. The boxers wanted to get in on this too. They wanted to put on a benefit bout, have some fights, and again, donate 100% of the ticket sales to the Eastland Relief Fund. And I never figured out what was up with this. It says up to the mayor. I don't know if it was because it was boxing or what, but the mayor had to okay this, but he did. So the boxers had a couple fights, and again, donated 100% of the ticket sales. The movie theater and the theatrical companies, they wanted to help. So they put on special performances and again, donated the proceeds to the Eastland Relief Fund. The theater people, their goal was $50,000 for the relief fund, and they passed that by a mile. And there's always that one idea that sounds good. Okay, maybe there's those ideas that just never sound good. One movie theater company had an idea. Believe it or not, there was someone with a movie camera at the dock when the Eastland rolled over. Now, it wasn't running, so they didn't actually capture the ship turning over, but they got all the aftermath. So someone had the great idea of showing that footage at a movie theater. The mayor of Chicago quickly put an end to that idea. Like, no, we're not watching the tragedy again. And no one saw that footage for about 98 years. The film got lost. It was found in a vault just before the 100th anniversary of the disaster. So it is out there now, but it took almost a century before anyone saw that footage. So the city of Chicago is really going all out to help the victims or the families of the victims. Then there's this guy. He is a young college student, and he's working a summer job for the Western Electric Company. He's also trying to make his college football team in the fall. So He's supposed to be on the Eastland. He wanted to get there early. He wanted to be on the Eastland, but he wanted to stop by the football coach's office and step on the scales because something to do with his weight. I don't know if he was trying to put some on or take some off for the position he wanted to play, but he stopped by his coach's office to step on the scales, and that made him late. And so he missed the Eastland. And so he survived, and football fans everywhere are grateful for that because this is a young George Halas. This is the guy that went on to found not only the Chicago Bears, but also the National Football League. Had he not stopped to get weighed, we might not have Monday Night Football. And it might be the only time in history that someone can document that it was a good thing they stepped on the scales. Chicago is facing a huge problem. You have over 800 people to bury. It's July. It's 1915. This is a time when graves are still dug by hand. So you have 150 ministers of different denominations meeting to sketch out a plan. How do you bury this many people? And on the day of the funerals, the church bells over Chicago didn't stop all day. Again, even if you didn't have a connection to anyone on the boat, you heard it all day long. Factories. Oops. Our battery's running low. I'm talking too much. I'm wearing out the battery. Did I step on a cord somewhere? It's actually not on this screen. It's only on the TVs. Yeah. But industry stopped. Businesses closed for the day so people could go attend the funerals. People were going to the services even if they didn't know the people that were being memorialized. They just went to be supportive of their community. And here's the scene that was going through the streets of Chicago. Stacks of caskets on the back of cars. You didn't have one or two in a hearse like normal. They had to pile them on cars. The funerals were for 9, 10, 12 people at once. These people could not even get a personalized funeral. There were so many lost. And I can't tell exactly, but when I counted, I believe there's 9 caskets at the front of this church. That was the scene around the city. And people want to know why. Remember, there was no fire on board. This is not a ship that was caught in a storm. This was not a ship that collided with another vessel in fog. It was a gray day. It was a rainy day, kind of drizzly, but it wasn't a storm. It wasn't in the middle of the lake. This was a ship that rolled over, sitting there tied at the dock. Somebody had to do something wrong. And when you have that in your face for a whole week, the faces of those lost, and you're listening to the funeral bells, you want to know who screwed up and why. So the coroner's jury is told, fix the blame. Figure out who's to blame for this, because someone has to be. This cannot be what we call an act of God sinking. Ships don't roll over tied to a dock. Everyone wants to find out who's to blame. Eventually, the officers and crew of the Eastland itself are arrested. One thing raises eyebrows. The chief engineer, the guy that was pumping in the ballast water, is actually the son-in-law of the steamboat inspector that okayed the ship to sail that year. People wondered if there was a connection there. Captain Pedersen says something that catches people's attention too. When he's arrested, he says, I'm going to tell you what I know. He doesn't deny any wrongdoing. He doesn't declare his innocence. He simply says, I'm not going to be made a scapegoat. I'll tell you what I know. Okay, Cap, what do you know? You have always the armchair quarterbacks, right? And someone who claims to be an expert engineer, although he never gave his name, said someone had to be asleep at the job in the engine room. It has to be the engine room department's fault. One guy blames the ballast tanks. He says, you can't have empty air pockets at the bottom of a ship that wants to roll it over. And he says, I know what I'm talking about because I survived the Titanic 3 years ago. Two problems. One, those ballast tanks were full when it rolled over. Two, this guy did give his name. Not only does he not show up on the list of Titanic survivors, he doesn't show up on the Titanic's crew roster. So someone was out after their 15 minutes of fame. The Eastland owners came up with a very unique idea on who to blame. They blamed the Titanic. They said, you know, there's that bigger boat that sank a couple years ago, very famous. It's its fault. Because we all know the story of the Titanic, right? It sank. There weren't enough lifeboats for everyone. Well, in the wake of that sinking, the United States passed a law that all ships must have lifeboat capacity for everyone on board. And so ships like the Eastland had to add more lifeboats. And so what the owners of the Eastland claimed is it was those extra lifeboats they were forced to put on added too much weight and made the vessel top heavy. Oh yeah, almost forgot to mention, not only were extra lifeboats added to the top deck of the Eastland, the owners conveniently forgot to mention that they had added an entire layer of concrete to the top deck to make a dance floor. I am not a naval architect, but I believe cement is heavier than a lifeboat. Then the stories start coming out. And people start saying, no, that Eastland boat, it's been a problem ever since it was launched. It's always been cranky, as they call it. She has a history of almost rolling over. Turns out early on in her life, she almost capsized out in the middle of Lake Michigan. And the crew actually, supposedly, allegedly, turned the fire hoses on the passengers to get them back down below decks, to get the weight down at the bottom of the ship to keep it from rolling over. But apparently she heeled over dangerously close to that tipping point where she would have turned turtle in the middle of the lake on a calm day. Later on, but before the disaster, she had been sold to another company and she ran for a couple of years on Lake Erie. And it comes out that the steamboat inspectors in that part of the Great Lakes said as long as she stayed within a 5 miles of shore, she could carry 2,000 passengers. But if they went beyond 5 miles, that limit dropped to 653. There were 2,500 on board when she rolled over at the dock. And so people are going, why the increase in capacity? They didn't change the boat really from then. They pointed to the concrete deck and a few other alterations that were made. And they talk about another scare where she almost rolled over on a calm day and the crew using fire hoses because, you know, your ship starts heeling over, people run topside to go see what's wrong. And the crew turning the hoses on passengers to force them back down below decks. And people are saying there was something wrong with this ship from the beginning. You go in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, though, from her days on Lake Erie, that company was having trouble getting people to sail on her. And so they put this ad in the Cleveland Plain Dealer and said, if you are a licensed captain, if you are a certified shipbuilder, if you have any sort of legitimate credentials, and you can prove to us that the Eastland is not seaworthy, we'll give you $5,000. There's no fine print to this offer. If you have any sort of legitimate credentials and you can prove it, We'll give you $5,000 and we'll fix the boat. The reward went unclaimed. No one could prove that it was not safe, apparently. Chicago, the coroner's jury finally is ready to fix the blame, and they're going to indict 6 guys. Captain Pedersen of the Eastland, Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson, the guy who was pumping the ballast water in. Okay, so now this is Robert Reed, and this is Charles Eckliff. They are the 2 steamboat inspectors who certified the Eastland to carry up to 2,500 people. They will face indictment. Walter Greenbaum. Now, he is the guy who chartered the boats for Western Electric Company. That's all he did. He doesn't own Western Electric Company. He is the guy that was in charge of organizing the picnic, and he chartered the boats. And William Hull, he's the guy who owns the Eastland. These 6 guys will be brought up on charges. But first, they have to figure out where. Because 5 of these 6 guys live in Michigan. So where will the trial take place? It could happen in Grand Rapids in front of Clarence Sessions. And he's known to be more lenient to industry in cases involving industrial accidents. Or it could happen in Chicago in front of Kennesaw Mountain Landis. And to bring this totally back full circle back to my White Sox story, if you are a baseball fan, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, not only was he the judge, well, he is a judge, and he was the guy that headed up the initial investigation into the Eastland. He will go on to become the first commissioner of Major League Baseball, and he's going to be the guy that bans the White Sox players, including Shoeless Joe Jackson, for throwing the World Series in a few years. So there's all these little side connections. So they have to decide who is going to hear this case. Ultimately, it will be Grand Rapids in front of Clarence Sessions. And so everyone gets sworn in and they are ready to begin with the proceedings. And again, like I said, it will be in Grand Rapids, and it's quite the deal. It is some modern courtroom drama, really. They face 2 charges. One, they face a charge of negligence. They also face a charge of conspiracy to operate an unsafe vessel. Those are the 2 charges they're going to face. So the prosecution begins. And one idea that had been forwarded is that the Eastland had actually been sitting on an old piling from an old dock. And so that's what caused her to roll, was part of the bottom was sitting on a wood piling. And the prosecution said, you know what, we sent divers down. There is no obstructions down there. That couldn't have happened. And they point to the stories that I just told you about her almost turning over in the middle of the lake several other times. And the stories of just randomly listing to one side or another. And then strangely, in the middle, or actually toward the end of making their case, the prosecutors asked to have the trial moved to Chicago. They've made all their arguments and they're almost to their closing arguments. And they're like, Judge Sessions, we'd like to make a motion to move this trial to Chicago. And Judge Sessions is like, no, we're already halfway through the trial. It's going to stay here now. But that's just a really strange time for prosecutors to motion to move a trial. This guy, some of you may have heard of him already. His name is Clarence Darrow. And he is the premier celebrity defense attorney of his day. He gets all the famous cases out in California. He is very famous, making a lot of money. There is no way an attorney like Clarence Darrow is going to defend the chief engineer of the Eastland. Because, of course, the owner and the steamboat inspectors, they all got top-notch lawyers. And no one seemed to remember to hire an attorney for the chief engineer. So Joseph Erickson walks into Clarence Darrow's office and says, will you defend me? Now, why is Clarence Darrow in Michigan and not out in California with the high profile cases anymore? Because he got himself in trouble. He got caught trying to bribe jurors to rule in his favor. He had just recently been on trial himself, and one trial he was acquitted. The other ended in a hung jury, and he was not tried again on an agreement that he would never practice law in California again. So he is the premier defense attorney across the whole country, but his reputation is shattered. So he is going to defend a client that just 2 years earlier, he never would have touched. But he realizes the Eastland case is so high profile, he can save his legal career. So he's going to defend the chief engineer. And he's absolutely right. This does resurrect his legal career. I said, you may have heard of Clarence Darrow. This is the guy that defended the teacher in the famous Scopes monkey trial, the teacher that was put on trial for teaching evolution in the classroom. He does actually save his legal career in the Eastland case. The defendants start with the idea that the ship had actually been on an obstruction below the water. Probably not the case, but that's where they started. And you get a lot of drama, right? So the defendants are the captain and the chief engineer and the steamboat inspectors. They are taking the witness stand, and the prosecutors get their chance at them. And you have some real movie level drama of these people. They're trying to shake these guys on the witness stand, and they just can't do it. At one point, you see Robert Reed, the steamboat inspector, the prosecutors getting after him and just trying to rattle him. And he can't do it. In another scene, the captain, Captain Pedersen, is actually standing up in the witness box and screaming back at the prosecutor who's screaming at him. It's kind of like that, A Few Good Men scene, only it's real life. I wish they had like video cameras that were decent back then, because this had to be a great drama. And then Clarence Darrow pulls up one point. Remember, he's only defending the chief engineer. All the other guys got their own attorneys. And he had a really unique style. He spent most of the trial doodling pictures on a notepad, not even taking notes. He was doodling pictures. And he was not a real flamboyant attorney. He wasn't very dramatic. He was very, very calm, very soft-spoken. And he got up for his closing arguments, again, of just the chief engineer. And he reminds Judge Sessions, when that ship rolled over, my client, the chief engineer here, he stayed at his post, because the whole engine room did not flood. When the ship turned on its side, part of the engine room was still above water. And Joseph Erickson moved around the engine room by pulling himself along the pipes that were above his head, because he had one major issue. Some of the boilers went under the water. And when hot boilers hit cold water, they explode. He and his men stayed at their post and opened the relief valves and kept those boilers from exploding, saving who knows how many hundreds of more lives. And he just reminds the judge, he is in the water, keeping himself above water and moving around by pulling himself along hot steam pipes to make sure those boilers don't explode. Does that sound like a man who is conspiring to operate an unsafe vessel? If there was a conspiracy here, he'd have been one of the first guys out. That was his whole argument. Judge Sessions takes a couple of days and he issues the verdict of not guilty. And honestly, this is probably where the prosecutors made an error. One of their charges was conspiracy to operate an unsafe vessel, and conspiracy is very difficult to prove. Had they just gone with negligence, there may have been a case to be made. But as soon as you say there's no conspiracy, it's that much harder to convince someone of negligence. And Judge Sessions even says, the owners had the ship inspected as required by law. So if there's any fault here, it's not with the owner. They followed the law. So the ruling is not guilty for all 6 guys, and they get to go free. The steamboat inspectors categorically state they are never going to Chicago again because they could be tried again in Illinois if they were to go there. They claim they are never leaving the state of Michigan again, where they are safe. And Joseph Erickson was actually working in a piano factory. His license had been suspended pending the outcome of the trial. And a messenger comes and tells him he's been found not guilty. He had to go home. He was so overcome, he couldn't finish his work day. He had to go home. He does get his license back. He does go back to sailing the Great Lakes, and he retires several years later. But that's what happened to the guys and the people. What about the boat? You still have a wrecked passenger ship lying in the Chicago River. And it takes quite a while to raise the Eastland. They get her right about to this point, kind of that 45-degree angle, that magic point where she should start to right herself, and she just gets stuck right there. Eventually, I think it took about 2 weeks, and they finally got her upright. And even as they're raising the Eastland, 522 people are still missing. They get most of them eventually. Because then she almost comes upright and just gets stuck at that point. They even bring in the biggest wrecking tug or salvage tug on the lakes at the time. The famous tug Favorite shows up, and they're trying to help. Ultimately, 3 weeks, actually, I misspoke. 3 weeks to bring the Eastland upright. And most people assume she's going to the scrapyard because she's a mess. After 3 weeks in the Chicago River, that boat is a mess. So most people assume that she's just going to go to the scrapyard. And she's just going to sit there. And this is what she looks like after a few. This was the side that would have been on the bottom of the river. She's going to sit there for a while. And then finally on May 30th, 1916, she's towed out of Chicago. And once again, the city of Chicago turns out for this event, only it's to boo the ship. The Chicago River is lined with people who are booing an empty vessel. It's like they didn't get a guilty verdict on the people in the trial, so they're going to just vent their anger on a piece of dead steel. And one guy even calls it a ghost ship. They're just happy to see it leave. They want the Eastland out of there. But she's not going to scrap. She's actually bought by the Illinois Naval Reserve, and she's going to be turned into a training gunboat where she'll become the USS Wilmette. And she has a really cool story after her conversion to a gunboat. First off, she does train Navy personnel for World War I. U.S. Navy sailors are trained for the First World War aboard her. And then in the 1920s, she takes part in the infamous Battle of Lake Michigan. Did you know we had a battle on Lake Michigan? Well, it's some colorful phrasing, if you will. 102 years ago tomorrow. Those are actual photographs. Yes, that is a World War I German U-boat. It was obviously captured when the First World War ended, and it was brought over here as part of a victory bond tour. And so this is the UC-97, and they towed it around the Great Lakes region and selling victory bonds to people. But under the Treaty of Versailles, there was a time limit that we could keep any captured war material. And by a certain date, it had to be destroyed. So what do you do with a submarine? You tow it out in the middle of Lake Michigan and you use it for target practice. Enter the Wilmette / Eastland. And so you have these two guys, J.O. Sabin, who fired the first American artillery shell, and A.F. Anderson, who fired the first American torpedo. And they're just going to start popping holes in the UC-97 till it sinks. So there is, in fact, a World War I German U-boat at the bottom of Lake Michigan. There are some rumors that someone may have found it at some point, but nothing official and nothing confirmed. And there's another sidebar story to this little incident. Imagine, if you will, you are a Great Lakes captain of an ore boat northbound out of Gary, Indiana. And you see something off your port bow on the horizon, so you grab your binoculars and there's a German U-boat out there. That's not supposed to be there. And as you are watching, a gunboat sails over the horizon, and your ship gets buzzed by a military aircraft. In between wondering who put what in your coffee that morning, yes, that is 100% true. Apparently, before they did this, no one thought to issue a notice to mariners. And so there was an ore boat northbound out of Gary, and they watched all this happen. And the U-boat sank and the gunboat sailed away. The plane flew away, leaving one very confused crew, because as this was going down, the captain decided to order his crew, just to be safe, run a white flag up the forward mast. And as far as my research has gone, I believe this is the only case where a Great Lakes ore boat has ever surrendered to the U.S. Navy. But you now have an ore boat with a surrender flag flying and no one to surrender to, wondering where to go. That goes squarely in the column of "you can't make this up." But she's not done even yet. Oops, I gotta go backward just 1 second here. So she sinks the German U-boat. Well, then World War II starts. She's still in the Naval Reserve. She's still a training ship. She's going to train a whole new generation of naval personnel. The famous World War II correspondent Ernie Pyle is going to sail on her for 2 weeks. And for 10 days, she's going to carry Franklin Delano Roosevelt into Whitefish Bay with his military leaders for a war planning session. Eventually, she's going to be scrapped in the late 1940s. She finally gets to the point where she's just not useful even as a gunboat. And so they sell her to the scrapyard, and she will be scrapped in Chicago. Chicago will get her final revenge. But when I started this, I knew the basic story. I knew the story of her rolling over at the dock and being the deadliest shipwreck. I didn't know any of the rest of this. She had a whole second life, and she trained countless people who helped win both world wars and really scared one freighter crew. She has a whole nother story, a whole second life, and yet she's forever known. If you say the name Eastland, she's known for one thing. She's known for the 844 men, women, and children that she drowned in the Chicago River while tied at the dock. The deadliest shipwreck in Great Lakes history happened less than 50 feet from shore in a river that wasn't even deep enough to cover the boat that sank in her. And that is the story of the Eastlands.
Wow.
I did good. I made it in an hour. Told you there's a lot to that one.
How long was that boat?
That boat was a little under 400 feet. I can't remember the exact number, like 380, something like that.
They did not have enough pump out solids. Did they ever correct that pump out solid problem?
Well, a little bit of a problem there, because when she was converted to a gunboat, she becomes a military vessel. So details on conversions are scarce. Even though she's a reserve military vessel, they're not forthcoming with a lot of details. There are rumors that as a gunboat, they never emptied the ballast tanks. There are rumors that when they scrapped her, the inside of the ballast tanks were just total rust because they just flooded them and left them full of water. So I would assume they probably would have corrected that somehow. But as far as what they did, I don't know. That information wasn't available.
You know the name of that freighter and charter?
I do not. That was a little like 2-inch filler article on the very last, like page 36 of the Chicago Tribune. That's the only place I've ever found that story, but I wish I could, but they didn't give the freighter name. But having been on boats myself, I can only imagine the conversation in the pilot house. I can imagine how it's going, and no, I can't give an interpretation here. Knowing sailors. Any other questions?
So what is the name of? Number.
The hull number or the number of people that
Name.
it was the USS Wilmette. And so she didn't have a hull number because she was in the Illinois Naval Reserve. So she wasn't, I mean, she was part of the Navy, but she was a reserve training ship. So she didn't get a traditional hull number like a destroyer would have. Yep. Any other questions? All right, well, hey, thanks for coming out.